Yesterday we talked about measuring and sharing outcomes, and today, as promised, we're going to focus on research. But let's begin by reviewing a few of the reasons for why research is important for LPAA. So, firstly, students are our future. I think most people would agree. And so university instructors want to be sure that what they are teaching students is evidence-based. And then many of our funders and policymakers want to know that there is evidence for the effectiveness of what they're paying for. Is it worth the cost? Of course, those of us actually delivering service want to not only feel that we are providing state-of-the-art programs, but we also want to ensure that our clients know that what they're attending is evidence-based, that it's worth it, that it's state-of-the-art. In short, we really want to know what works and what doesn't work. So our goal is twofold today. The first one is to provide you with an overview of LPAA research and research that fits this model. And the second goal is to identify the research gaps, of which there are many. So this is harder said than done. And there are some barriers to identifying this evidence. If any of you have actually tried to do some searching on LPAA or social model treatment research, you will know that it is much more challenging than you may think. And there are several reasons for this. The first one is that a lot of the treatment research is identified with a specific treatment therapy method, not a general philosophy. So, for example, it's easier to search on group treatment or word-finding therapy, something very specific. Another reason is that you can't always determine the underlying values that guide a particular intervention. Not all of us explain a guiding philosophy that lies underneath what we are presenting. And finally, researchers, even in studies that are conducted within a social model, a social framework, don't always measure outcomes, don't always measure the outcomes that meet that LPAA value that we talked about, and Nina talked about in that very introductory talk about documented life enhancement changes. So now that you know some of the challenges that we face, and we want to be sure that your expectations are in the right place, because this is a pretty challenging thing to do, let's just talk a little bit about the actual review process. So this part of the work was done by Nina, so this is my huge acknowledgement to her. It was an absolute fortune of work. And how it started was a listing of the components of a social model or LPAA interventions. Then there was an online search using a wide range of keywords from that components list. And then Nina identified studies that had to be original research studies or systematic reviews that were published in English, obviously in peer-reviewed journals, and that contributed to LPAA evidence in some way. What Nina looked at with the studies is how they fitted into the LPAA model that we talked about right at the beginning. So how could we categorize some of the research that list that Nina came up with, how did it fit? And she looked at research that fitted that domain at the top, participation. After all, we're looking at a life participation model, and research that fitted the middle, the living with aphasia, the quality of life. Now, research that fitted some of the other domains was not excluded. However, that research had to have some outcome related to either life participation or quality of life, the living with aphasia. So those were, that was kind of the organization of that research. Now, the way that the results were organized further than that is looking at explanatory studies that addressed needs, treatment studies that targeted multiple domains, and this included research on program packages. So aphasia centers would fit into that category of program packages. And research on treatment delivery options is another way of organizing. So group therapy would be a delivery option. Treatment studies that targeted impairment, participation, environmental factors, and psychosocial factors. So there are some caveats for the researchers in the audience, and we are so pleased to have people with a primarily research background joining us today. So firstly, just to say that the first caveat that this is not meant to be an exhaustive traditional systematic review. What it is that it represents the highlights, the directions of research literature, and some of the generalities regarding evidence. And most important, I think, for us is identifying the research needs, because that might be the call to action of where we move. So we just quickly want to review something that I know many of you are familiar with. That's the levels of evidence ranging from class 1 right down to class 4 at the bottom. So as many of you know, the first level, I'm not going to go through all of them, is more where the randomized clinical trial fits, right down at the bottom, looking at case studies and something that many of us use, expert opinion. And then again, something that most of you are familiar with, the different levels of recommendation. And this is where it's really important for us, because if we want to ensure that LPAA-type interventions are part of best practice, which is something that I mentioned yesterday, what we need is that the people who write those are going to include it as an intervention that should be done. That means that it needs a certain level of evidence. And that's why it's important for us to try and produce some of that evidence. And I know Nina always makes the point that just because something is not there and it's not at level A evidence, it doesn't mean that it's a bad technique. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It means that we don't yet have proven evidence that would satisfy the powers that be that put that in. So I'm going to hand over now to Nina, who is going to start off by looking at research that demonstrates needs. Thanks.
Yes, I was becoming more and more anxious as Chris was talking, thinking of going from that really engaging, imaginative talk to this where our slides are even boring. So if you need a little nap, now's the time. Oh, dear. So anyway, as Aura said, this is really a gloss. It's kind of the tip of the research, picking out things, organizing it to look at a way we might consider the research related to LPAA. And as she said, the first set of research articles that I want to point out relate to needed services for people with aphasia and their families. So these are not treatment effectiveness studies that we're starting with, but explanatory research. And we primarily focused on needs that are not part of traditional language-oriented services. And these are divided into explanatory articles related to 5 particular needs areas. The studies that identify what people with aphasia and their families have reported that they need to live successfully with aphasia. To outcome goals as identified from the perspective of people with aphasia and their families. Information needs that our consumers have reported. Studies of environmental barriers for people with aphasia, and finally, studies of the need for management of depression or low mood, since this is a particularly vulnerable population. So let's start with the first one. A series of qualitative studies in Australia have focused on identifying what is needed to live successfully with aphasia. People with aphasia and their family members were asked that question. There were 2 series of studies with over 80 interviews across the studies that revealed factors that contributed to positive outcomes or living successfully with aphasia or not. And the themes for these were participating in meaningful activities was important to living successfully, social support was important, that is having relationships with other people, communication, and not just the ability to communicate, but opportunities and success in communicating with other people. And finally, positive feelings like optimism, hope, dignity. And the authors concluded from this series of studies that it's important to explicitly address these themes and ensure outcomes related to these themes. And of course, going back to the first session yesterday, these map perfectly onto some of the principles of LPAA that we talked about. A second series of articles identified needs in aphasia management relative to treatment goals, and I think I mentioned this study yesterday. Australian researchers interviewed 50 people with aphasia and their family members, as well as 34 speech-language pathologists to identify their priority goals. The SLPs tended to report language impairment goals, whereas people with aphasia and their families appear to report activity and participation goals. So after analyzing their data, the authors highlighted the need to address goals that are identified by consumers, people affected by aphasia, in order to ensure patient-centered care and meaningful outcomes. The third category of needs includes information needs of people with aphasia and their families. And here there were 3 studies that employed qualitative methods or survey research with over 368 participants living with aphasia participating across the 3 studies who provided their perspectives on information needs. And the consistent findings were that people with aphasia and their caregivers want and need more information about aphasia and stroke. And this information is needed immediately after onset and then repeatedly throughout the continuum of recovery. And this information is not always readily available or accessible. And so the conclusion is that there's a need for accessible information about stroke and aphasia throughout the continuum of care. There were 5 studies and 1 meta-analysis of 3 additional studies that identified environmental barriers that require modification to improve communication of people with aphasia. Collectively, these studies suggest that people with aphasia are often marginalized by an inaccessible society. Environmental barriers exist across multiple ICF subcategories, For example, the meta-analysis looked specifically at healthcare environments. Other of the studies looked at other types of environments. And finally, many environmental barriers can be removed or diminished to improve participation of people with aphasia. And so the conclusion, intervention should address the communication environment. The last category of needs involves the need to address prevalent issue of low mood or depression among people with aphasia. This need comes from research on stroke in general, as well as aphasia-specific research. And I'm just going to run through some of the findings. It's estimated that between 33 and 79% of stroke survivors experience depression. Depression has been associated with longer hospital stays, higher mortality, and greater healthcare utilization. Stroke patients with depression tend to profit less from rehab and have poorer outcomes. In the UK, it was estimated that an investment in psychological care after stroke would lead to a reduction in health and social care costs of 37% over 2 years. That's pretty sizable. Patients with aphasia have a higher incidence of depression than stroke survivors without aphasia. The risk of low mood or depression does not appear to abate after the first year post-onset. And finally, caregivers of people with aphasia also have significantly worse outcomes, with caregivers of non-aphasic stroke patients having better outcomes or with worse outcomes. I said that all wrong. Anyway, you know what the point is. The implication of this research is that aphasia management should include some way to address issues related to low mood and depression among people with aphasia if they're to get maximum benefit from rehab and the best outcomes. Okay, let's turn to treatment studies that focus on what works or not. And I want to remind you of the way we're organizing the evidence into these categories. So the studies have been divided according to ICF or AFROM domains, and the way the studies were chosen is they're put into the domain that's the explicit focus of treatment, so where the treatment actually focuses. And I want to start with studies that focus on treatment of multiple domains, that is, intervention that targets more than one of those AFROM dimensions. We found 3 studies of LPA aphasia community programs that evaluated the outcomes of the package. That is, no specific services were singled out. The studies focused on evaluating programs as a whole. This slide demonstrates examples of the programming across the 3 studies, just to show you the types of offerings that were included. I know it's kind of a busy slide. Not all of the programs included all of these, but if we look at the studies together, we can see that the programs provided intervention directly targeting multiple domains. So, for example, conversation groups or recreational activities for participation, counseling related to psychosocial needs, caregiver programs to address the environment, working on specific communication skills to address the language impairment. And here's a composite diagram of the outcomes across these research studies. Outcomes were evaluated across domains except, interestingly, for the language impairment. Again, not all the studies evaluated all domains, but these are the ones that were included, and these are the ones that showed positive change. So the good news is that all studies reported positive outcomes across 4 of the 5 domains after a period of participation in an LPA-oriented community program. However, the bad news is that these are case series designs. A case series is defined as a group of participants exposed to one treatment where outcomes are measured before and after exposure to the intervention. So there's no control group involved. If you remember from the slide that Ora showed about the levels of evidence, case series designs are actually a low level of evidence because there's no control group. You don't know if the change would have happened anyway because there aren't people that are not getting that intervention. So from the perspective of evidence-based treatment, we can't make recommendations using one of those metrics like the AAN levels of recommendations based on these 3 studies. But the good news, again, is that this is a great first step. This is a start. So the studies demonstrated positive findings. They demonstrated the feasibility of measuring multiple outcomes. They laid the groundwork for now conducting something like randomized controlled trials. The next studies investigated outcomes of intensive comprehensive aphasia programs, or ICAPs. ICAPs involve services for aphasia that are offered intensively over a relatively short period of time. The studies that you see here evaluated the whole ICAP package. They describe services including groups, functional therapy, impairment-based therapy, and in fact, they create community because the participants typically eat together, they get to know one another, and so it really fits with that sort of essence of LPAA. All of these studies found improvement in functional communication, and one found improvement on quality of life as measured by the ALA. The conclusion from the 3 ICAP studies are the programs resulted in positive outcomes for participants with aphasia. The studies employed a case series design, and one was a retrospective study. So at this point, we can't make recommendations based on these studies, but again, this is a great start. They moved along the evidence path, but further study is needed to make recommendations regarding ICAPs. The last research that I'll talk about under multiple domains involves group therapy for aphasia. And this one's a little dicey because some of the groups target different domains. And so you can have a very language-oriented group or a very participation-oriented group. But one of the key LPAA values involves helping people connect with other people. And so and y'all can fuss at me after the talk, but I ended up grouping 2 systematic reviews of group therapy together, even though they did involve groups that had different aims. So you see the Salter et al. Reviewed 6 aphasia group studies, and Lanyon et al. Reviewed 29 studies of outcomes from outpatient and community groups for aphasia. Salter et al. Found there is moderate evidence that group intervention results in improvements in communicative and linguistic measures among patients with chronic aphasia. The Lanyon et al. Study was really a more comprehensive review, and they broke down the research into designs, as you can see here, so 4 randomized trials and so forth. Across the 29 studies reviewed by Lanyon et al., there were many types of outcomes measured. You see that outcomes represented multiple domains, and again, it doesn't mean that every study measured all of these domains, but the highest quality of evidence, such as those 4 RCTs, typically involved language outcome measures, and that's really important because if we're talking about making recommendations based on the highest level of evidence, and they measured language outcomes, then that's what ends up getting recommended. So you'll see that as we move through. After evaluating the research quality of all the studies, the conclusions were that evidence definitely favors group intervention to improve language. However, there was insufficient evidence of the impact on actual participation or quality of life. So there were improvements in outcome measures across all the categories, but not enough well-designed studies that specifically looked at participation and quality of life. To me, this is one of those big priority things because we've been shown how to do good research on group. Now we just need to extend it into looking at participation outcomes, and that's important from an LPAA perspective. Okay, let's shift to looking at interventions that focus on a specific domain. And this is just a reminder of the categories. We'll start with the language impairment domain. And basically, there's not a lot of research on the impact of specific impairment-focused therapies on actual life participation. While some researchers have begun to use quality of life measures as one outcome, many impairment-focused studies stop short of measuring true participation outcomes. And this is probably because of lack of agreed-upon participation-focused outcome measures. That was the first question that was asked yesterday when we started. So that's a big need. I'm going to just take an example from the impairment domain. By far, I think the most common type of impairment-oriented treatment in the literature is word finding or lexical retrieval treatment. There are many studies that contribute to some fairly good evidence that semantic or phonologic treatments can improve word finding. But what are the effects of this treatment on other domains? So if we treat word finding as a language-specific treatment, what's the impact on participation, on actual engagement in daily conversation by people with aphasia? And again, I'm going to draw an example from semantic feature analysis. As you all probably know, semantic feature analysis, or SFA, is a particular intervention designed to improve word retrieval in aphasia. I think it's a good example of the increasing efforts to extend linguistic measurement and treatment into other domains. So things have been moving in that direction. As described in the literature, I think SFA could easily fit within an LPA philosophy. For example, Antonucci has described SFA intervention within the social context of aphasia groups, and Mary Boyle has talked about that in citing that literature also. The effects of SFA on word retrieval at the word and discourse level have been investigated. However, most of the outcomes relate to elements of discourse or elements of conversation, such as word retrieval within a discourse task or informativeness within conversation, rather than the actual level of participation of people with aphasia in conversation. So from an LPAA perspective, this research is moving in the right direction, but still has a little way to go to look at the impact on participation. And I think the same story applies to other types of word-finding therapies. These are largely small N studies with actually mixed results relative to conversation-level outcomes. And as I said, the problem is probably finding outcome measures that are both sensitive to the specific treatment that's being done and captures broad-level participation impacts. Okay, so lexical retrieval was really an example of issues related to LPAA treatment in language domain. Let's move on to look at intervention focusing directly on participation, and this might include working on specific skills or resources required to participate in an activity or actually being immersed in an activity. The first examples will relate to conversation. And a kind of weird one that I've put in here comes from a randomized, that's a research term, weird one. A randomized trial by Bowen and colleagues in the UK, and some of y'all are probably familiar with this study, was actually not about conversation therapy. What they did was they compared best practice speech-language therapy, which was described as largely impairment-based therapy, to conversation with socially skilled visitors in the first 4 months after onset of aphasia for 170 adults with aphasia. On the activity scale of the therapy outcome measure, both groups improved, and there were no significant differences between the two groups on that measure. Now, you can interpret this in a lot of different ways, and I'm just kind of making a general, throwing out this thought. But to me, it's interesting to think about what it says about skilled volunteers leading conversational participation, and the possibility of that offering some support, this study offering some support for that. So something to think about. You know, there are in aphasia centers often, like in the Aphasia Institute, volunteers that are very skilled that run conversation groups. So maybe this speaks in a little way to that, even though it didn't mean to. In a review of conversation therapy that I did with Megan Savage and Linda Worrell, we identified 30 research articles, and you can see the distribution of research designs for these articles that focused on conversation therapy. The majority of the studies delivered conversation therapy but included a communication partner in the training. And so the research is kind of intermingled with that partner training research. However, the outcomes related to engagement and conversation. And based on this review, we might infer that evidence probably favors conversation therapy, and working on conversation, particularly with regular partners, is possibly something that should be done with people with aphasia. The next examples of participation domain I'm calling activity-focused intervention, and this category is defined as intervention focused on training skills to facilitate a person's participation in a specific life role or in a specific activity. And unfortunately, the literature didn't offer a lot of studies in this regard. And actually, if you know more studies that fit into these categories, it would be really nice to start collecting them. So, you know, pass them along. Maybe that's something AphasiaAccess can become a conduit for. There were 4 examples of activity-focused intervention in the literature, 2 focused on helping a person with aphasia teach, and 2 focused on training functional activities, and you see them listed here. You'll notice that they all have low numbers of participants, and in fact, 3 out of the 4 were single case designs. In all cases, the person with aphasia succeeded in performing the particular activity or activities that were targeted, so the measure of success was doing the activity. The studies provide descriptive information to support future research, but the research designs and the small number of participants preclude making evidence-based recommendations of this particular approach. The next 2 examples are what I'm calling participation immersion, where people with aphasia are given an actual opportunity to join a real-life event or activity with support. And both of these studies, the Cherney et al. And Tamplin et al., measured psychosocial impact of actual participation. Cherney et al. Studied the impact of an aphasia theater program on communication, confidence, and mood after participation, and Tamplin et al. Studied the impact of joining an aphasia choir on psychological distress. And they both had positive findings. But again, we can't make definitive recommendations, but we can see an avenue here for future research. I think this is one of the most valuable things about this whole talk, is sort of looking at how people envision doing this kind of research and then copying them. As an aside, in the Cherney et al. Article, I was really struck by an important statement that they made about the theater program, and they said something to the effect that the tests often did not capture the depth of meaning for people with aphasia of participation in their theater program. And they had a quote from one of their participants that said, "I realize, though, I'm gaining a lot, not only the play, but life. That kind of says it. So this personal depth of meaning is so important to keep in mind when we're putting so much emphasis on formal tests and statistics. And I think Catherine kind of spoke to that yesterday, that there are stories under there that have meaning beyond the statistics. Well, moving right along. Let's look at intervention focusing on the environment, that is anything external to the person with aphasia. The most widely researched aspect of the environment is training of communication partners. There are actually 4 reviews providing positive evidence of partner training. Turner and Whitworth reviewed 9 studies and all reported favorable outcomes. Bradley and Douglas reviewed 19 studies and all reported favorable outcomes. Wilkinson and Weilert reported 6 studies that reported favorable outcomes. And then I, along with colleagues that you see here, completed a systematic review of 31 studies. And you see here the breakdown of the types of research that were included in that systematic review. Now, just summarizing from the systematic review, we concluded that partner training is effective in improving communication support skills of the partner, and that it's probably effective in improving communication of people with chronic aphasia when they're interacting with a trained partner. The most effective approach is direct training of communication, even though we did find articles with positive outcomes in areas that were like, a general education approach with to-do type of suggestions. So the conclusion is that communication partner training should be provided for people with aphasia and their partners. Another way of improving the communicative environment is to increase the knowledge of caregivers and family members regarding stroke and aphasia. Salter et al. Reviewed 3 studies related to caregiver education in aphasia. They found moderate evidence that caregiver education resulted in temporary alleviation of stress, and limited evidence that education resulted in improved knowledge and family adjustment. But if we look beyond the aphasia literature to the general stroke literature, we find more definitive conclusions. So Forster et al. Reviewed 21 trials that included over 2,200 patients and 1,290 caregiver participants. And their review concluded that evidence supports caregiver and patient education. So if we pull together the stroke literature and the limited aphasia literature, we might conclude that evidence supports family or caregiver education. Providing information improves knowledge of stroke, satisfaction with services, and possibly positively impacts mood. So we probably should do, well, I think we should do, patient and family or caregiver education. Another category under the environment is use of or access to external support resources. So that's like things like low-tech materials, such as pictographs, remnant books, aphasia-friendly written materials, communication booklets, even prompts written on your partner's forehead. This is very bizarre, I know. The studies that are included here are only those research studies that explicitly evaluated the impact of supports on communication or communication participation. We didn't include those studies that included supports within the context of something else like partner training. A total of 10 articles were identified. 7 of these were single case studies, and 3 were experimental but with relatively low numbers of participants. All demonstrated positive outcomes of communication or participation using the supports that were provided. So this is a positive direction of the evidence, but still insufficient for definitive conclusions. The last environmental example is high-tech support, that is the availability and use of electronic devices to support communication. Here we relied on one systematic review Baxter et al. Reviewed 14 studies of AAC and aphasia. They found variability in outcomes, with some people becoming independent and even extensive users of augmentative and alternative communication. Others ended up with no functional usage. So they concluded that high-tech AAC holds potential, but this has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. For the last domain, psychosocial factors, we're going to focus only on studies that address psychosocial issues such as mood, confidence, identity, and there were 4 studies that addressed the impact of a therapy that was aimed at mood or well-being. Each study used a different approach, including a psychologist-led behavioral management, narrative therapy, family therapy. Across the studies, there was a positive impact of treatments on measures of mood. People with aphasia should have access to this type of intervention. Okay, so can we sum some of this stuff up? And please remember, these are tentative conclusions that are really based on a gloss of the literature. It just starts us thinking about how we might approach this task. And it also starts us thinking about what areas are really priorities for focusing. First, we have some evidence of the need for services to improve life participation, knowledge, communication environment, psychosocial adjustment. Regarding the intervention, I'm going to make some WAGs. Y'all know WAGs, wild ass guesses. Oh, I hope that didn't get recorded. I'm going to use a table that shows the category of research, whether there's evidence of positive outcomes on participation and quality of life. So it's focused specifically on that. And whether our gloss suggests that the research meets any of those metrics for recommending treatment and what's needed next. So for the 2 categories, community aphasia programs and intensive programs, yes, we have positive evidence of impacts on quality of life and functional communication. However, not enough evidence to make recommendations. We need randomized controlled trials. For aphasia groups, yes, we have evidence of the impact on language and communication, but we don't have sufficient evidence on the impact on participation. So we need research, high-quality research that focuses on that. It's really hard for me to say much about the impact of impairment therapy because we didn't look at that. That's a huge literature. It almost made me cry when I started to do it. So there's just so much there that that's something that needs to be gone into in much more detail. But even though we can recommend impairment therapy as a way to improve language, my sense is that we're short of evidence on the impact on participation and quality of life at this point. In the participation domain, there is positive evidence of effects of conversation therapy, and maybe enough to say that it probably should be done, but more research is definitely needed to focus on this, on conversation therapy, independent of the partner training literature. For participation approaches that train in activity or provide opportunities for participation, yes, there were positive outcomes, but not enough to make definitive recommendations, so higher level research is needed. For environmental intervention, yes, there were some positive outcomes. We should probably train those who communicate with people with aphasia. Having said that, we need more evidence, more participants in those kinds of trials. Regarding caregiver education, we have positive evidence and sufficient to recommend this for providing evidence and education to family members and people with aphasia, but we could use more evidence related specifically to aphasia, and also more evidence of how that impacts participation. Regarding technology, the findings were mixed. We probably need a program of research to identify not only what works, but with whom and when since there were variable results. And finally, there was positive evidence supporting intervention for mood and well-being. Whoops, I'm behind myself. We can probably say, yes, people with aphasia should be offered counseling or similar interventions, but again, further research is needed. Now, don't get depressed by all those need more research recommendations. The trends are promising, and we have some really what serves as feasibility and exploratory studies to build upon. And remember, research is kind of like women's shoes. One can never have too many. And the researchers present here would be out of work if all the questions were answered. So, where to from here? Based on what we've presented, we have an opportunity to come together as a community to join the clinicians and the researchers here and everybody else for that matter, to look at what might happen. So possibly as a group, AphasiaAccess could be a conduit for helping identify research priorities, immediate needs and longer-term needs. Maybe a consensus process that's facilitated by AphasiaAccess to look at priorities. Can we agree on core measures to look at outcomes that are meaningful for people with aphasia? Is it possible to come together to address the need for high-quality research with larger participant numbers? Perhaps this conference can be a start for networking and bringing people together for multi-site research. And perhaps you all have some ideas of things that, as a group, we can do to move forward. So, thank you.